Welcome to Compact History from compacthistories.com, where we explore the stories, events, and moments that shaped the world. In short, bite-sized episodes. This is episode 132. The History of Whisky. Whisky begins with a simple combination of grain, water, and yeast, but its origins are anything but simple. No single person invented it, and nothing has been found that documents the moment when someone first transformed fermented grain into the spirit we recognize today. Its story instead begins with the much older art of distillation, a process developed and refined across several ancient civilizations before reaching medieval Europe. Early distillation was not usually concerned with making drinks. Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and Arab scholars used versions of the process to produce perfumes, medicines, and concentrated chemical substances. During the Middle Ages, European scholars translated Arabic scientific works into Latin, helping to spread knowledge of distillation through universities, monasteries, and medical communities. Distilled alcohol became known as aqua vitae, meaning water of life, and was prescribed for almost everything from stomach complaints to smallpox. Monasteries played an important role because monks possessed the ingredients, equipment, and literacy required to experiment. Wine was distilled in parts of southern Europe, but grapes were difficult to cultivate in the colder regions of Ireland and Scotland. There, barley was abundant, and fermented grain offered a practical alternative. The resulting spirit was fiery, clear, and probably rather rough. It was not necessarily matured in wooden barrels, so it would have tasted very different from modern whisky. One of the earliest written references associated with Irish whisky appears in the Annals of Clonmacnoise. Its account for 1405 records the death of a clan chief after consuming too much aqua vitae at Christmas. The manuscript was compiled later, so it cannot settle every argument about whisky's origins, but it shows that distilled spirits had become familiar in medieval Ireland. The earliest surviving Scottish reference is more precise. In 1494, the Scottish Exchequer Rolls ordered 8 bowls of malt to be given to Friar John Core so that he could make aqua vitae for King James IV. That quantity might have produced hundreds of bottles by modern measurements. Distilling was evidently no longer a tiny medical experiment. It had entered royal life. The Gaelic expression Uisge Beatha in Scotland, or Uisge Beatha in Ireland, was a translation of aqua vitae. English speakers gradually shortened the first word into forms such as usquebaugh, which eventually became whisky. By the 16th century, knowledge once concentrated in religious and learned institutions had moved into farms, households, and private estates. Distillation was becoming part of everyday life, particularly in Ireland and Scotland, where two closely connected traditions would now begin to develop identities of their own. As distilling spread beyond monasteries and royal households, it became rooted in the rural economies of Ireland and Scotland. Farmers could turn surplus barley into a product that was easier to store, transport, and sell than the grain itself. A small still could provide drink for a household, hospitality for visitors, and an additional source of income. Whisky was becoming both a social custom and a valuable commodity. In Ireland, the Crown attempted to control production through licensing. In 1608, King James I granted Sir Thomas Phillips a license to distill whisky in and around Coleraine. This is often connected with the later Bushmills tradition, although the present distillery should not be treated as an unchanged business dating continuously from that year. More importantly, the license demonstrates that commercial distilling had become valuable enough to attract government attention. Irish distillers developed several approaches, Some used malted barley, while others combined malted and unmalted barley. The latter practice eventually helped create the distinctive single-pot still style. Triple distillation became common among many Irish producers, although it was never universal. It generally produced a lighter spirit than traditional double distillation, contributing to the reputation of Irish whisky for smoothness. Across the Irish Sea, Scottish distilling developed strong regional characteristics. Highland producers often worked in remote glens where water, peat and barley were readily available. Peat could be burned to dry malted barley, allowing its smoke to influence the flavour. Peatiness was therefore a consequence of available fuel and local methods before it became an internationally marketed style. Scottish distillers generally used double distillation, although lowland distilleries sometimes used 3 stills. Copper pot stills allowed distillers to separate the spirit into different portions. The undesirable early and late parts of a distillation run were excluded, while the central portion, known as the heart, was retained. Shape, size, and operating method all affected the resulting flavour. Early whisky was commonly consumed young, sometimes flavoured with herbs, honey, or spices. The importance of long maturation emerged gradually. Spirit transported or stored in wooden casks changed over time, gaining colour while extracting compounds from the oak. Producers and drinkers eventually realised that aging could soften harshness and create richer flavours. Neither Ireland nor Scotland had yet established the tightly defined legal categories known today. Methods differed between districts, families, and individual distillers. The two industries were also closely connected, with knowledge, workers, and business interests moving between them. Their growing success, however, made official indifference impossible. Governments saw thousands of stills producing a highly saleable drink, frequently beyond the reach of the tax collector. Whisky was about to become the subject of duties, licenses, raids, and one of the most persistent smuggling cultures in British and Irish history. The struggle to tax whisky transformed its production. In Scotland, the first official excise duty on distilled spirits was imposed by the Scottish Parliament in 1644. Further regulations followed after the 1707 Acts of Union joined Scotland and England under one parliament. Taxes were intended to raise revenue and supervise quality, but high duties often made legal production less attractive than illicit distilling. In the Highlands, the landscape favoured those who wished to avoid the authorities. Stills could be hidden in glens, barns or caves, while smoke from the fire beneath a still was less visible at night. Smugglers used remote tracks to move casks towards customers, and local communities frequently protected them. Illicit whisky was not always regarded as criminal by the people producing or buying it. Many saw the excise laws as distant interference in a long-standing rural practice. Excise officers faced threats, false information, and elaborate deceptions. Some distillers created concealed rooms or quickly dismantled their equipment when a raid was expected. Others worked with corrupt officials. Robert Burns, later celebrated as Scotland's national poet, became an excise officer in 1789, an awkward position for the author of enthusiastic tributes to Scotch drink. Ireland experienced similar tensions. Governments repeatedly altered duties, licence requirements, and restrictions on still sizes. A tax on malt encouraged distillers to use unmalted barley alongside malted grain. This produced a spicy, full-bodied spirit and helped establish pot-still Irish whisky. Regulation had accidentally influenced flavour. The decisive Scottish reform was the Excise Act of 1823. It reduced duties and allowed distillers to obtain licenses for a fixed annual fee, making legal production commercially realistic. George Smith of Glenlivet, was among the first Highland distillers to secure a license under the new system in 1824. His decision was unpopular with some former smugglers, and tradition holds that he carried pistols for protection. Gradually, however, illicit production declined as licensed distilleries expanded. The reforms allowed legal Scotch whisky to flourish, with more than 300 licensed distilleries operating during the years that followed. The Scotch Whisky Association's historical overview traces the connection between taxation, smuggling, and the 1823 reforms. Technology then changed the scale of production. Traditional pot stills worked in batches, requiring repeated filling, heating, and cleaning. In 1830, Irish excise official Aeneas Coffey patented an improved continuous still. His apparatus could produce spirit faster, more cheaply, and at a higher alcoholic strength. Many large Irish pot still distillers distrusted the lighter product, but Scottish manufacturers recognised its possibilities. They combined grain whisky from continuous stills with strongly flavoured malt whisky, creating consistent and approachable blends. This new style arrived just as an unexpected crisis was about to weaken the drink that dominated fashionable European tables: brandy. During the second half of the 19th century, blended Scotch whisky became an international success. Merchants, including Andrew Usher, helped establish the practice of blending malt and grain whiskies into reliable commercial products. Firms such as John Walker & Sons, James Buchanan, and John Dewar & Sons developed recognizable brands, while improved bottles, railways, and steamships made distribution easier. Scotch also benefited from catastrophe elsewhere. From the 1860s, the phylloxera insect devastated European vineyards, damaging the production of wine and brandy. British drinkers seeking alternatives increasingly embraced whisky. Blends were generally lighter and more consistent than many individual malt whiskies, making them suitable for customers unfamiliar with the spirit. Ireland was initially a formidable competitor. During the 19th century, Dublin possessed some of the world's largest distilleries. Jameson, Powers, and George Roe employed large workforces and operated barrel-making workshops and extensive warehouses. Between 1823 and 1900, Irish whisky output approximately quadrupled. Dublin producers increasingly used the spelling whisky, including the letter E, to distinguish their pot still product from competitors. The official Irish Whisky Technical Specification describes this golden age and the industry's subsequent decline. Meanwhile, migrants had carried distilling traditions across the Atlantic. In colonial North America, rum was initially important, but settlers of Scottish and Irish ancestry produced whisky from local grain. Rye thrived in Pennsylvania and Maryland, while maize became central farther west. Whisky served as a drink, medicine, and trade good, and in places where coin was scarce, it functioned almost like currency. In 1791, the new United States government imposed an excise tax on distilled spirits. Small Western producers believed the measure favored large Eastern businesses. Resistance culminated in the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, when President George Washington called out a militia to enforce federal authority. The rebellion collapsed, but whiskey's political significance was unmistakable. Kentucky became closely associated with Bourbon, a whiskey made predominantly from maize and aged in new charred oak containers. The precise origin of the name remains disputed, with both Bourbon County and New Orleans' Bourbon Street appearing in competing explanations. Tennessee producers developed a related tradition, often filtering new spirit through sugar maple charcoal before maturation. Canada also created its own whiskey industry, frequently using maize for the base spirit and rye-rich whiskey for flavoring. By the late 19th century, North America possessed several distinct regional traditions. Whisky had moved from farms and hidden Highland stills into factories, export warehouses, and global brands. Yet its dependence upon governments, international trade, and public acceptance left it dangerously exposed. During the early 20th century, war, revolution, and prohibition would bring parts of the industry close to destruction. The 20th century opened badly for many whisky producers. Ireland's industry was especially vulnerable. Political instability disrupted business, the First World War restricted grain supplies, and the Easter Rising of 1916 damaged parts of Dublin. After Irish independence, economic conflict with Britain further reduced access to markets across the British Empire. The greatest blow came from the United States. National prohibition began in January 1920, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating drink for beverage purposes. America had been an essential market for Irish whiskey, and its closure removed customers almost overnight. Scotch producers suffered too, although their broader export networks offered some protection. Prohibition did not eliminate drinking. Whiskey was smuggled across borders, manufactured illegally, and sold through speakeasies. Genuine products were joined by counterfeits of uncertain quality, damaging the reputation of established brands. There was also a medicinal exception. Doctors could prescribe whiskey, and licensed pharmacies dispensed it, allowing certain businesses to operate within the law. Canadian distillers were well placed to supply the illegal American trade. Ships carried liquor to points beyond United States territorial waters, while smugglers transported cases across the long-land border. Figures such as Al Capone made fortunes from illegal alcohol, although organized crime dealt in far more than whiskey alone. Prohibition ended in December 1933, but the industry could not instantly recover. Distilleries needed capital, equipment, and years of maturing stock before they could fully supply the market. American producers then faced the Second World War, when many converted their facilities to produce industrial alcohol for explosives, medicines, and other military requirements. Scotland also endured restrictions on barley and production. Yet whiskey became economically important to wartime and post-war Britain because exports earned valuable American dollars. Winston Churchill intervened when proposed restrictions threatened supplies, recognizing that whiskey was not merely a drink, but a significant source of foreign currency. After the war, Scotch companies concentrated increasingly on international sales. Irish whiskey remained in severe decline. By 1953, only 6 distilleries were operating on the island. In 1966, the major southern businesses of John Jameson, John Power, and the Cork Distilleries Company merged to form Irish Distillers. Production was eventually concentrated at a new Middleton distillery, opened in County Cork in 1975. Bushmills remained in Northern Ireland, leaving the once mighty industry dependent upon very few sites. Elsewhere, another tradition was taking shape. Japanese whiskey pioneer Masataka Taketsuru had studied production in Scotland before returning to Japan in 1920. He helped establish Yamazaki for Shinjiro Torii and later founded the company that became Nikka. By the 1970s, whiskey had survived taxation, political upheaval, 2 world wars, and an attempt to ban its largest market. What followed was not merely recovery, but a reinvention that would transform a traditional spirit into a remarkably diverse global industry. Whiskey's late 20th century revival began unevenly. Blended Scotch remained internationally successful, but changing tastes created difficulties in some markets. Vodka and lighter drinks attracted younger consumers, while the Scotch industry accumulated excess stock. Numerous distilleries closed during the 1980s, leaving enthusiasts to wonder whether some traditional whiskies would disappear permanently. At the same time, drinkers began paying greater attention to single malt Scotch. Previously, malt whisky had mainly supplied blends, although a few distilleries sold it under their own names. Glenfiddich's international promotion of single malt from the 1960s helped develop a new market. Consumers became interested in distillery character, age, cask type, and region. Closed distilleries eventually acquired almost mythical reputations as their remaining bottles became scarce. Bourbon experienced a similar reassessment. Small batch and single barrel releases encouraged drinkers to regard American whiskey as a premium product rather than an inexpensive mixer. Producers experimented with different grains, warehouse locations, and finishing casks while remaining within legal definitions. Rye whiskey also returned to prominence, assisted by the revival of classic cocktails. Irish whiskey began recovering after decades of contraction. Cooley opened in 1987 as Ireland's first new independent distillery for generations. Investment in established brands, particularly Jameson, rebuilt overseas demand. During the 21st century, dozens of distilling projects appeared across Ireland, reviving regional production and introducing new interpretations of malt, grain, and pot still whiskey. Japanese whiskey gained extraordinary international recognition. Producers combined Scottish inspiration with Japanese techniques, climate, and meticulous blending. Award-winning releases generated global demand, sometimes exceeding available mature stocks. Distilleries in countries including India, Taiwan, Australia, Sweden, and England also demonstrated that noteworthy whiskey did not belong exclusively to its oldest producing nations. Legal definitions now protect many traditions. Scotch whiskey must be made and matured in Scotland for at least 3 years in oak casks. Irish whiskey must be produced on the island of Ireland and similarly matured for at least 3 years. Bourbon must be made in the United States from a grain mixture containing at least 51% maize and matured in new charred oak containers. The rules preserve identity while still leaving substantial room for creativity. Even the spelling reflects history rather than a universal law. Scotland, Canada, and Japan generally use whisky without an E. Ireland and the United States usually prefer whiskey with an E, although individual brands sometimes break the pattern. Today's industry combines science, agriculture, craftsmanship, and marketing on a worldwide scale. Modern laboratories monitor fermentation, yet distillers still rely upon grain, yeast, copper, oak, and thyme. Every glass carries traces of medieval medicine, monastic learning, rural ingenuity, smuggling, taxation, migration, and industrial invention. Whiskey survived because it continually adapted, but its appeal still rests upon something wonderfully old-fashioned, transforming a harvest into a spirit, then waiting patiently for wood and time to perform their work. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact History, part of the Compact Histories Network. Please don't forget to follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, so that you don't miss any future episodes. And consider leaving us a rating or a review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find new episodes at compacthistories.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, warfare, science, mysteries, true crime, and disasters. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/history and click on the coffee cup to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.